Hi, today I'm going to talk about natural selection and genetic mutations. And genetic mutations are at the heart of natural selection. If it wasn't for genetic mutations, I wouldn't be sitting here now and you wouldn't be listening to me. In fact, the human species would not exist and neither would any other species. So we rely on genetic mutations in order to provide the wherewithal to survive all the different environmental, the external and internal environmental conditions that we are likely to encounter in the millions of years of our evolution. So today we'll be looking at genetic mutations, the raw material of evolution. And just by the way, I just remind you that one of the reasons I look up all the time is because I'm talking to you on my laptop, and my notes are on my desktop computer, which is situated above the laptop. If I'm going to make any sense at all, I need to be able to refer to my notes, and hence look up towards heaven. So the first item is genetic mutations, the raw material of evolution. The second one is gene flow and how that affects natural selection. Of course, we'll mention what gene flow is. And we'll look at geology and genes, the geography of life. And we'll look at genetic drift and what that is. And that happens when evolution becomes random, and it's not really due to environment. It's just one of those things that happen. And then we'll look at rapid evolution within species, which contradicts Darwin's thoughts, which were that evolution is a long, slow process. And we're going to look at evolution in the laboratory. And then finally, the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, starting with Darwin and adding on all the things that we've learned since then, since Darwin. Now, the first item on the list is genetic mutations, evolution's raw material. And in this section, we're going to be looking at the number of genes we have per cell in our body. And of course, we have trillions of cells in our body. How mutations occur, the effect of mutation, the mutation effects, and how helpful mutations get passed on. Unhelpful ones, of course, don't get passed on because they're unhelpful to the sustaining of life. So if you can't sustain life, you don't get passed on. And Dan will have a look at a summary of that section. So firstly is the genes per cell. The human genome, that's the sort of the complete set of instructions for a single human being, is somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 genes long. And the early researchers thought that was incredibly small compared when you think of all the things that are contained in the human body and all the instructions that are needed to keep it, how to build one, how to run one, and how to maintain one. But that's all we have. And these genes, these 22,000 genes, are made up of approximately 3 billion DNA base pairs. You might remember that the base pair is the rung on the helix, on the double helix ladder that we spoke of in the last lecture. So there are 3 billion of those individual rungs, and it's those rungs that contain the information, like I said, for building a human being, for maintaining one, and for repairing one. And a human genome is about 6 feet long if you stretch it all out, straighten it out, 6 feet long. And we've got one of these in each of the 3 trillion cells that we have in our bodies. All of that information is wound up together along with some proteins, and it's packaged into 46 tiny packages called chromosomes. So you've got 46 bundles of DNA or base pairs in the helix, double helixes, all packaged into these 46 packages. However, we get 23 from our mother and 23 from our father, and that makes the total of 46 in all. And all of these fit into the nucleus of a cell, not just into the cell itself, but into the little package in the middle of the cell. So as you can imagine, they are very microscopic. Now, mutations occur every time a DNA is copied. Unlike a Xerox photocopier, it's not guaranteed that when our DNA copies, it's going to be an exact copy of what the original was. There are always typos, typographical errors, you might call them, in splitting the DNA and reassembling it in the new cell. So these mistakes, these typographical errors, are called mutations. And there are many, many ways that a mutation can occur in a human being, and they're occurring all the time as we go through life. And that's why when as we get older, when the repair side of our DNA is sort of not working so well anymore because it's sort of worn out from too much use, when that repairing process doesn't happen, then the mutations don't get repaired, and little by little, bits of us malfunction as we get older and older and older. It's not always a what do you call it, catastrophic malfunction. Very rarely. Mostly it's just tiny little bits, bit by bit. Sorry for the bad news, but there's no escaping it. So that's the way life is. Now, these DNA copying errors, some of them can be where you get a C base is copied as a G, a G base is copied as a C base. So that is a genuine typo. It's where in the copying process, a mistake in the type of base that those rungs on the ladder is made. So you get the wrong information or the wrong type of protein at that point. And sometimes an entire stretch of DNA can get copied incorrectly. So it's not just the bases, but a whole strand. What do you call it? A gene. A gene is a section of DNA, as we saw. They can get copied incorrectly, and sometimes they can get copied in reverse order. So it comes out backwards. So you can see the chances of things going wrong in human beings, or in any species for that matter, is quite large. However, like I said, a lot of these are small. They're small, inconsequential results at the time. And some of them are helpful, and some of them are neutral, and some of them are harmful. Of course, the harmful ones don't get passed on account of they don't allow the person who has the harmful mutation to pass things on. The neutral ones might get passed on, and the helpful ones definitely will get passed on in the right environmental circumstances. As I said, most mutations either create problems or don't have any effect at all. And there are mutations that can involve big changes that may lead to death. And this is especially true if the mutation is in a sperm or in an egg cell. The resulting embryo won't survive very long. However, mutations may be either neutral or positive as well. And I said the helpful mutations get passed on simply because they're the ones that, under the current environmental circumstances, enable the owner of those mutations to reproduce, and reproduce better than someone who had maybe a harmful mutation. So you can see that the helpful mutations are going to increase with time. So to summarize this section, mutation provides a source of variations, and variation is the keystone of natural selection, of Darwin's theory of evolution. Without variations in a species, it won't survive long, given the changes in environment. Of course, if the environment never changed, the species would go on forever, being exactly the same as it always has been, never changing. However, the environment is not able to stay the same on account of the planet Earth is changing all the time. Has always been changing and will always change. So there's always going to be, and of course we get outside interference from other parts of the universe, sending deadly rays and big lumps of rock and big lumps of ice and all sorts of things that can impact the Earth from time to time, changing the environment drastically. Of course, we have our own problem with large earthquakes and large volcanoes, large volcanic explosions that have blotted out the sun for years on end, which of course create a problem for the species. And then if a variation helps in that situation, then those particular members of that particular species are likely to survive and reproduce, and then that variation gets passed on until the next environmental disaster. And of course, you can see that's a bit like a sieve. With each disaster, with each natural disaster, or maybe a internal like a internal disaster like a pandemic happening, like we have at the moment. A pandemic, if it's severe enough, can wipe out people who are susceptible to it, but people who have a helpful variation that enables them to survive the pandemic, they will pass things on, and there, of course, with time, their particular mutation will get more and more frequent in the species. And that's a bit like a sieve effect. Now, passing on to the next section, which is gene flow, and we're going to see what effect that has on natural selection. And in this section, we're going to be looking at what effect distance has versus a similarity of environment. And we're going to look at the effect of distance and time in making a new species. We're going to look at reproductive isolation as being the key to speciation. In other words, speciation is a fancy word for making a new species. And then we'll have a summary. So the first thing is distance. So Darwin worked out that distance is a key factor in creating new species. So in this section, we're talking about creating new species, not just helpful mutations, but a complete new species. And if a species gets separated by some geological factor, and it's usually geological, of course, in this day and age, we could get separated by hopping on an airliner and moving to another country. But in evolutionary times, we didn't have airliners. All we had was continental drift. So as continentals drifted apart with plate tectonics, it created distance between populations of the same species. And over time, a new species can evolve out of that. Now in the Galapagos, which is those islands just off the South American coast in the Pacific, there were multiple islands, and the distance between them helped create a new species. For example, there were finches on one island develop a mutation that make them different from finches living on another island. And that mutation with time gets more and more common. And however, why finches can't fly from one island to another, I'm not quite sure. But that's what happened. It actually did happen that the finches developed into different species on different islands because I guess they didn't feel like flying to another island. Yeah. And of course, with non-swimming and non-flying species, then of course the chances of them being separated by even a small distance over water can be quite significant. Now, of course, with time, the differences between the species get larger and larger. In other words, with those finches, with time, as time went by, the number of variations that occurred within each different branch of what used to be the same species, and now the different species, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the longer they are apart, without any possibility of coming together to procreate, is means that the differences between the species are going to get bigger and bigger. And of course, as I said, the reproductive isolation is the key to creating a new species. So if at some stage you have to excuse me today, it's a bit cold today, and being of a certain age, cold weather makes my nose run. So apologies for that. Anyhow, it's necessary that when a species gets separated into two populations like that, in order to create a new species, there cannot be reproductive connection between the two. In other words, either branch of the former species has to be completely reproductively separated from each other with no chance of mixing. And that is the absolute key. If two branches of a species get separated, however, there is some migration between the two, then no, you won't get a new species. You may get different variations of the same species, but it won't develop into a totally new species. And with different species, even though they might have started from the original species together, if you try to mate them together, they won't turn out. You might get an offspring. However, there will probably be problems with that offspring, and particularly when it comes to breeding from a pair of these new combinations. Won't work. Like, for example, they crossbreed a horse and a donkey, and they get a mule. But you can't get a mule by breeding a mule with a mule. You got to keep breeding horses and donkeys to get mules, and that's because they have incompatible alleles. Now, remembering, allele is one of a pair of genes that we inherit one pair from. We had one gene from for a particular, say it's color of eyes, for example, talking about eye color. You get one gene for eye color from your mother, or it's a set of genes, right? Set of genes for eye color from your mother, and you get another set of genes for eye color from your father. And the in the normal course of events, the dominant genes, dominant eye color, will prevail. However, if it happens that the pairs from mother and father are not compatible, then you're going to end up with problems. Yes, I don't know exactly what happens with eye color in that case, but it creates problems for that particular trait, be it no matter what it is, hair color, eye color, shape of your ears, shape of your nose, all that sort of stuff. So it can be possible for these genes to be incompatible with each other, even though they were okay in your mother's mob and it's okay in your father's mob. You put them together, then you can get an incompatibility. Rare, of course, in human beings, but it can happen. So to summarize, movements of individuals and their genes from one place to another is called gene flow. So when you get people, or any species for that matter, that separate, they take their genes with them, and if they start a completely new species, that's the basic set of genes they start with, and then you get variations over time, but there'll be different variations in the different populations. And like I said, the populations living in different places remain similar to one another as long as they share genes through sex. So you get two populations, separate locations, but so long as they're intermixing for sex, then they'll remain similar. Maybe not exactly the same due to mutations. However, they will be similar. But if there's no mixing through sex, then eventually you will develop a new species. So that's gene flow, and so gene flow can help natural selection, or it can counteract it. In other words, natural selection could have produced a particular trait in a species which was adaptive, and then along comes this movement from one place to another, a new species starts, or changes occur, then the new change can go against the previous natural selection and sort of create a different type of natural selection. And you can see that with human beings and chimpanzees. In fact, we were the same species until 2 million years ago. For the first 6 million years, it's from 6 million years to 4 million years ago, and that's 6 million years to 2 million years ago, we were actually members of the same species. And 2 million years ago, something happened. We went our way, they went their way. So you can see that that change, that particular change, a speciation change, seems to helped us in some ways much more than the chimpanzees had. In other words, chimpanzees stayed more like apes, whereas we became less like the hairy apes and became a different sort of ape, an ape that sort of builds cities and flies airliners and goes to different new planets. But the chimpanzees did not develop those advantages, even though we were members of the same species once. Okay, now geology and genes, it's also called the geography of life. And it's also called biogeography. So biogeography is where species are separated by water or by land. In other words, you can have a very, like the Amazon River, for example, a very fast-flowing, large river that makes it impossible or very difficult for some species to cross. And also mountain ranges. Mountain ranges can arise over millions of years, and sometimes even shorter time spans. And that can separate species, and they can't get together for reproduction purposes. Also rising and lowering sea levels. As when the sea levels were lower, there was more commonality amongst species. As the sea levels rose, member populations of the same species were separated, and in different places they developed differently and developed into new species. And also plate tectonics is where the plates that the continents sit on are moving, and it's all moving all the time. And for example, once upon a time, South America and Australia were the one continent, and the marsupials developed on that one continent. And then plate tectonics, little by little, over millions and millions of years, pushed South America and Australia apart. And we've got marsupials in both continents. However, the type of marsupials we have is very different from the type of marsupials they have, but they're still nonetheless marsupials. And moving on to the summary, here we go. So the distribution of a particular species can be affected by geological events over periods of time. So like I said, we pushed apart by plate tectonics, by rivers forming, by seas rising and lowering. I guess even volcanic action can cause a form of biogeography at times. And we've been through all of those types. Now we're moving on to the next section, which is genetic drift, when evolution is random. So it's not due to environment, it's not due to anything other than pure chance that genes can change over time through mutations, just random mutations. So you can get a population which isn't developing into a new species, but in a different part of the country or the continent that they occupy, because the member of that species are sort of mating more often than they would with the other populations of the species, then you're going to get mutations, different mutations in each population of the species, and that will cause different changes in the genetic composition of each. And this is called genetic drift. And so it's just random fluctuations in how common particular genes or alleles, remembering that alleles are those pairs of genes, or one particular, an allele is one part of a pair of genes for the same trait, like eye color or hair color. And this can happen in any population. It doesn't have to be environmentally induced. It's just a random thing. Just like I said, the copying errors when our cells divide and the DNA has to copy. So you've got the exact copy of, it's supposed to have an exact copy in the new cell that you had in the old cell. Sometimes mistakes occur, and over time these mistakes multiply. In other words, they get passed on, and then mistakes get built on mistakes, and all sorts of different changes and variations in the species' external traits and internal structure can change. And this, once again, this also can affect natural selection. So although natural selection might have, over the millennia, a species may have developed certain traits, that's behavioral traits and physical traits, change due to genetic mutations. When you get genetic drift, as these random sort of changes for no good reason, it can actually counteract natural selection. So it can set a species back a little bit in terms of its fitness for the current environment, or fitness for the next change in environment. Remembering that global warming and global cooling has been a regular thing over billions of years. But having said that, it normally happens very, very, very slowly. You don't often get a sudden change in climate like we have now. From a geological or evolutionary point of view, the change of climate that we have at the moment is more rapid than it has ever been in the past. Much more rapid. And different people can make up their own minds as to what's causing that. Okay. Right, so that's genetic drift and natural selection. It can also reduce genetic diversity. You can have a particular diversity in a population, and with these random variations, that diversity can become reduced, particularly if a population is very small. If you get a small population, then this genetic drift can, and like random mutations, random changes, can severely reduce the diversity in the population, and therefore its chances of survival through the coming millennia. Remembering, we're not talking about tens of years or 20s or 50s or hundreds of years. We're talking about thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of years at work here. So in small populations, because you get more inbreeding, there's not a lot of, the chances of encountering another member of that species, or a female, or whatever it might be, a male or female, opposite type, in that species that doesn't contain similar genes or same genes, same DNA that you have, then it gets smaller and smaller with time. So the possibilities of inbreeding in that small population with time gets greater and greater and greater. And because of the chance of harmful recessive genes occurring, then the chances of that population increasing and growing and getting stronger gets less and less and less, until they get to a thing called the extinction vortex, which means over time the small population gets weaker. Well, I'll say weak when I say weaker in terms of survivability of the next coming disaster, environmental disaster. So over time, they get more and more vulnerable until they reach a point, a certain threshold, where they're in the extinction vortex, which means after they get to that point, the only way is down. There's no way of surviving that particular species surviving. Although in these days we have members of species in zoos and other places, other collections, and if a species in the wild is likely to become extinct, there can be human intervention to try and help it, or maybe human intervention to reduce the impact of human environmental change on a particular species. And that can help bring back a species from the extinction vortex. But in the natural situation, where you don't have any way of no external intervention at all, then once they get into that extinction vortex, the only way from there is down. Mind you, it's possible the human race could get into one of those one day to its own stupidity and weird ideas. All right. Okay, so a summary is that genetic drift is just a random fluctuations in how common a particular gene is in a species. So it's got nothing to do with the environment, it's just random, like mutations. And it's more likely to happen in small populations. And if it does happen in a small population, then over time, the chances of that small population dying out is quite great. Right, now rapid evolution within species. And in this section, we're going to be talking about how Darwin was wrong about the speed of evolution. Not entirely wrong, just partly wrong. We're going to talk about the Galapagos finches and how they evolved rapidly. And we're going to talk about the effects of human actions on species. Yep, and hunting and fishing, and I have a summary. I will also talk about species stowaways. And a species stowaway is where a particular member of a species or bunch of members of a species hop on a ship or a aircraft. So they survive the trip, get off at the other end. Like, for example, if you're in an aircraft and you're in the cargo hold, and you're a pretty tough critter, then the chances are you will survive the trip. If you're hanging onto the back of the wing, chances are you won't survive the trip. And similarly on ships, if you stayed away in a hold somewhere, or if you're hiding in a hold somewhere, then when they empty the hold, you can crawl out, and then I'll start building a new population of that species in a new place, which means a new course of evolution. So Darwin was very much in favour of slow evolution. However, in recent times, research has shown that some species have developed quite rapidly. For example, there are 13 species of Galapagos finches, and they've been studied, and the evidence seems to indicate that they have evolved comparatively rapidly. In other words, it wasn't over billions of years, millions of years. We're down to sort of 100,000 to 300,000 years, which in Darwinian terms is rapid, believe it or not. In evolutionary terms is rapid. So the common ancestor of all the 13 species of Galapagos finches lived 2 million years ago, so they're about as old as we are. And then as they settled on these particular islands, now remembering that the sea levels have gone up and down in that time. What else? I don't think in 2 million years you would have had some tectonic drift, significant tectonic drift, but probably be more likely to do with sea levels, and how easy it was for a particular the species to end up on different islands in the Galapagos. So members of this, this 13 different species that came from the common ancestor ended up on different islands. Then I guess the seas rose, and with the seas rising, they were separated, and they didn't realize that they could fly a little distance and get to meet their cousins. So they tended to stay at home and developed into different species. And that's happened over, like I said, over the last 100,000 or 300,000 years, which in evolutionary terms is quite rapid. And based on DNA data alone, it's been worked out that it is possible for a new species to emerge in as little as 200 years with sustained change in a single direction. So if there's an environmental change over that time and there's no sort of side tracks that are going to require a new set of helpful mutations to survive, then in theory, a new species could evolve in 200 years, which is almost down to our sort of capacity to think about. Now, an example is, although this is not really a different species, it's more like a trait of a single species, and that is before the Industrial Revolution in England, they had moths that used to be eaten by birds, which is quite common. The lighter coloured moths that settled on the dark tree, on the, so make sure I got this the right way around. So as the Industrial Revolution went on, the colour of trees and buildings changed. In other words, it went from being their normal colour, whatever it might have been, which means that the lighter coloured moths would have survived better because they were better camouflaged against the tree or the building. Whereas the darker coloured moths, they were going to be what do you call it? Gobbled up by the birds. Now, as the due to the what do you call it, carbon deposits from the Industrial Revolution, and the environment grew darker and darker in England, the lighter coloured moths were now standing out quite prominently. So they began to be eaten by the birds, which meant that the darker moths survived better and bred more. So you got more dark moths around during the Industrial Revolution and beyond, up until quite recently. Then you had the light coloured moths. Then back in the 60s and 70s, in England, they thought, well, maybe this is not a good idea, having all this soot and smoke and stuff. So they brought in environmental laws, and the environment started to lighten up again. So there wasn't so much soot in the air, and the buildings and the trees began to become lighter in colour. And lo and behold, then it became the dark moths that got eaten by the birds, and the lighter ones survived. So now there are more light moths around than there are dark moths. So that's how easy it can happen. All you need to do is have a bit of an industrial revolution, and you'll get a form of species, not quite a species change, but a change in a particular aspect of a species. And we talked about stowaways, and you get hunting and fishing as well. So stowaways can go from one place to another and start a new colony. Hunting can reduce a particular type of a species. For example, I guess in some places where they hunt reindeer or antelope, or not antelope, those other things with big horns. The hunters prefer, well, traditionally have preferred the males with the biggest and bestest set of antlers, which meant that those males were taken out of the breeding stock, which meant that over time, the males weren't getting big antlers anymore. They were getting smaller and smaller antlers. It didn't stop them breeding, of course, but the hunters couldn't find, if the hunters wanted big antlers, they couldn't get them anymore because they'd changed the number of, or the DNA or the genes for those big antlers had been taken out of the population. Same with fishing. If they fish a particular quality of fish or type of fish, then that fish will become less common, and other types of fish will come in to fill up the environmental gap, take their place, and that can cause species changes. So, just to summarise, evolution can be quicker than Darwin thought, and the Galapagos finches have actually been evolving over 100 to 300,000 years, rather than 100 to 300 million years. And the industrial pollution has changed the environment, and therefore the predation of species. International travel has also changed the spread of species around the earth, and then hunting and fishing can change the characteristics of a species. Now, looking at research, there are two ways of doing research. You can go out into the field and you can study the animal or the species in the wild, or you can bring them into the laboratory and do experiments on them in test tubes and things like that, or on their gene, not the animals themselves, but on their cells and genes and stuff. Now, the advantage of the field research is it's closer to reality. In other words, the results you get there are more likely to be the results of the real world rather than an artificial laboratory world. However, in a laboratory, if they take a particular species, a species of bacteria, for example, they can produce 1,000 generations in 2 weeks. Now, that's plenty of time to see evolution. So if they can fiddle with the genetic characteristics of a particular bacteria or other small critter, and then see what happens in the laboratory over a relatively short period of time, they can see evolution at work. So that's an advantage. Like I said, it has no resemblance to what happens in the real world because they're fiddling with it. It's not in in normal environmental conditions. However, it does give us an insight into the processes involved in evolution. And not only that, now they've got all these powerful computers. They can do computer simulations of natural selection. So they can create a theoretical species, or even a real species, and program in particular tendencies to genetic mutations and tendencies to environmental change, and see what happens in theory, in computer time, over tens, hundreds, millions of years. And they can do this in a matter of a few minutes on these powerful computers. And they can work out what would happen if these set of conditions existed at the beginning. What would happen over 2 million years? And they can find that out in 5 minutes. But once again, it is divorced from reality. It is artificial. It probably wouldn't not really happen in the real world, but it gives us some idea of what's going on, what the processes are, what is possible in terms of not as far as what we can do, but of what nature does. Okay, moving on. To summarize that part, field research is more realistic than laboratory research. However, in the laboratory, they have more control over the variables involved, and they can use microorganisms to compress the evolutionary process to a couple of weeks, and they can use computers to run simulations of evolution given certain variables, certain parameters. Okay, now getting to evolution's modern synthesis. Hard to say that. Evolution's modern synthesis, which is just a fancy way of saying how do people who are interested in the evolutionary process think of it now rather than back in Darwin's time. And we'll be talking about the basic principles of modern evolutionary theory, which boil down to, number one, genes are the basis of hereditable traits. Number two, genes are passed intact from parents to offspring. So you need to believe these things. If you don't believe these things, then evolution is a non-event. So number one, genes are hereditary. In other words, that's what makes hereditary. And genes are passed down from parents to offspring, right? You need that. Mutation and recombination are random processes that create new genetic diversity. So in other words, we have mutation and maybe new ways of things coming together, recombination, that create the diversity that we need for natural selection. Then after that, genetic traits become more or less common over generations through natural selection. So in other words, if you start out with a particular bunch of traits, given different environmental conditions, some of these traits will be passed on more readily than other traits because they are helpful in those particular environmental conditions. And those that were unhelpful get weeded out because they won't survive. Their parents won't get to breed, and or at least their children won't get to breed. Parents may breed, but the children won't live long enough to breed, and therefore that particular variation, branch of diversity gets weeded out. And of course, the movement of individuals leads to gene flow between populations. So you can get a bunch of genes taken from one place to another. And if the conditions are right, you can even get a new species occurring out of it. And the last point is genetic traits can become more or less common over generations through genetic drift. In other words, even though a species may have developed some really, really good, you call it mutations, helpful mutations over time, with genetic drift, they can be set back a little bit just through random chance until the next disaster comes, in which case the helpful ones will be passed through and the unhelpful ones won't. Okay, so that's natural selection and genetic mutation. So I guess the take-home message is human beings and other species have genetic mutations happening all the time. Every time a cell divides, there's going to be some mutation or other, and these are just tiny little things. Very rarely is it like an immediate catastrophic failure of the organism, but over time, with little by little, the organism can get less adaptive and less fit for the environment, less fit to reproduce over time. And it's genetic mutations that account for, in my opinion, it's genetic mutations that account for the wide differences in human behavior that we see. I mean, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but you take a bunch of children from the same family, and they've more or less been, within certain limitations, they've more or less been exposed to the same environment. So the environmental conditions have been pretty similar. I mean, the differences are not enough to worry about. Okay, so environmentally the same. However, each member of each of the children are very different. I mean, they each got like their parents' DNA. How come they are different, so different from each other? And how come over lifetime people can change in their behavior? And in my estimation, a lot of this is down to mutations. But I don't want to give the impression that everything's down to genes. No, it's not. It's 50% genes and 50% environment. Remembering that for a gene to work, for a gene to do its thing, it has to be triggered by an environmental condition. Otherwise, it won't do its thing. So no, the old worry that they had that if human beings were just instinctual, like they thought other animals were, which is not true either. They thought we were purely instinctual, then there'd be no good and bad. I mean, we are what we are. You couldn't blame anyone for the way they were. You couldn't punish anyone. We couldn't change. Be no change involved. but that's not true. Yes, we do have a genetic component to our behavior, and yes, the environment is important in how that genetic behavior plays out. Be more about that as the course progresses. But I just wanted to clear that up now, that it's not all genes and it's not all environment. It's a combination of both. They're interdependent. In other words, without the genes, the environment would do nothing. And without the environment, the genes wouldn't do much either. So we need both. So like I said, the second take-home message is that the way we have thought about human behavior up till now, about the human species, about human life, has been totally wrong. I mean, we had a fair effort. Given that we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the scientific expertise, we didn't, and we had all sorts of other considerations like politics, religion to consider. We've done pretty well to get to where we are. However, in order to get the real answer, to find out what's really going on with us human beings, we need to start factoring in biology, factoring in what's our basic toolkit when we arrive, and remembering each baby's basic toolkit is different, even though they have the same parents and they grow up in the same environment. It is different because, number one, genetic mutations. Number two, even with the same genomes from mother and father, the way they are combined, which ones are kick in, which ones don't kick in, is quite different. And so if you add to that mutation, then we've got a very complicated stew to try and work out. But my message is, if you want to fix a problem, you've got to know what it's. You got to have the information. You can't fix a problem that you don't know about. I mean, if you don't have all the data that relating to that particular problem, there's no way you're going to fix it. So, what you call it, wishful thinking isn't going to change the world. The only thing that's going to change the world is accurate knowledge. We get accurate knowledge, then we're at the starting point. If there's enough wise people around to interpret that accurate knowledge correctly, or near enough to correctly, then we can start to develop a theory of the human species, the human mind, that is realistic, that will enable us to cope with the way that human beings are and the daft things that we get up to. Okay, well, I've enjoyed talking to you, and I look forward to sending you a new topic next time. Okay, have a good week. Bye for now.